Victoria Hayes stood motionless at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Chicago penthouse. Watching the autumn rain streak down the glass like tears she refused to shed. Below her, the city hummed with life, thousands of people moving through their evening routines, heading home to families who actually wanted them there. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and wondered if anyone down there could see her. This ghost woman trapped in a tower of steel and luxury. 6 months had passed since her wedding day. 6 months since Nathan Grayson had walked into her dying father's real estate office in the small coastal town of Harborview and offered a deal that seemed like salvation. Her father's company was drowning in debt after a development project collapsed. They were going to lose everything the business her grandfather had built. Their modest family home, even the money needed for her mother's ongoing treatment for chronic illness. Nathan's offer had been simple and devastating. He would absorb the debt, save the business, and ensure her mother received the best medical care available. All Victoria had to do was marry him. She had seen his photograph in business magazines before that day. Nathan Grayson, the real estate genius who had transformed skylines across America. At 35, he had built an empire of commercial properties and luxury developments that made him one of the wealthiest men in the country. He was striking in a severe weight all and broad-shouldered with jet-black hair, piercing gray eyes, and features that looked carved from marble. Handsome, yes, but in the way a statue is handsome. Beautiful to look at, impossible to hold. Their wedding had been a sterile affair in a lawyer's office. Nathan had worn a charcoal suit and shaken her hand afterward like they had just closed a business deal, because that was exactly what it was. A transaction. She was not his wife. She was an asset he had acquired to tick some box in his carefully ordered life. The penthouse reflected Nathan's personality perfectly. Everything was expensive, modern, and utterly cold. Chrome fixtures gleamed against dark hardwood floors. Abstract art that Victoria did not understand hung on stark white walls. The furniture was designer quality, but uncomfortable, chosen for aesthetics rather than warmth. It was the kind of home featured in architecture magazines, the kind that made visitors whisper in awe. It was also the loneliest place Victoria had ever lived. Nathan was rarely home. He left before sunrise and returned after midnight if he came home at all. Some nights Victoria would hear his car pull into the private garage at 3 in the morning. Other nights he stayed at one of his hotels or in his downtown office. When their paths did cross, usually in the kitchen early in the morning, he would nod politely, sometimes comment on the weather, and then disappear into his study or out the door. They had never shared a bedroom. Victoria had her own suite on the east side of the penthouse, complete with a king-size bed she slept in alone, a walk-in closet full of expensive clothes Nathan's assistant had purchased, and a bathroom with a tub she never used because bathing in silence felt even more depressing than showering. Nathan's master suite was on the opposite end of the apartment, and she had never seen inside it. The distance between their rooms felt symbolic of everything wrong with their arrangement. Victoria had tried to make the best of things in the beginning. She had arranged fresh flowers in every room, thinking they might soften the harsh edges. She had attempted to cook dinner on the nights Nathan mentioned he might be home, carefully preparing meals she thought he might enjoy. She had even waited up several evenings, dressed nicely, hoping they might have a conversation that went beyond weather and schedules. But the flowers wilted without anyone to appreciate them. The carefully prepared dinners grew cold and eventually ended up in the trash. And the conversations never happened because Nathan never stayed long enough to have them. Her days developed a routine, born of desperation to fill the empty hours. She woke alone, exercised in the building's private gym where she never saw another soul, read books in the library that made her cry because the fictional characters had more meaningful connections than she did, and took long walks through the city. The penthouse staff treated her with careful politeness but maintained their distance, as though they had been instructed not to get too familiar with the temporary Mrs. Grayson, because surely everyone could see this marriage was not real. Surely everyone knew she was just playing a role. Her parents called every week, their voices bright with pride and relief. They thought she had found love with this incredible man. They believed she was living a fairy tale, rescued from their small-town struggles by a prince in an expensive suit. Victoria could not bring herself to shatter their illusions. They were so happy, so grateful, so convinced their daughter's sacrifice had turned into something beautiful. How could she tell them the truth? That she had traded her freedom for their security and found herself imprisoned in luxury, married to a man who treated her like an expensive piece of furniture he had purchased but never used. The loneliness became a physical presence in Victoria's chest, a heavy weight that made breathing difficult some mornings. She missed home desperately. She missed the smell of salt air and the sound of waves crashing against the harbor. She missed her mother's warm hugs and her father's terrible jokes. She missed having friends who knew her, really knew her, not just the polished surface. She presented to the world as Nathan Grayson's mysterious wife. It was on a gray October afternoon, when the loneliness felt particularly suffocating, that Victoria found herself in Millennium Park. She had walked there without any real destination in mind, just needing to be somewhere with other people, even if she was not actually with them. The park was busy with afternoon visitors. Families with children, couples holding hands, groups of friends laughing together. She found an empty bench near the famous Cloudgate sculpture and sat down. Watching all these people who had what she wanted most: connection, belonging, love. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Victoria closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sky, imagining for a moment that she was back in Harborview, standing on the beach near her childhood home. If she concentrated hard enough, she could almost hear the seagulls and feel the sand between her toes. A voice interrupted her daydream. "Those clouds look angry. Mind if I share your bench before the sky opens up?" Victoria opened her eyes to find a man standing nearby, smiling at her with genuine warmth that felt startling after months of Nathan's cold indifference. He was handsome in an approachable way, with light brown hair that was slightly wind-tousled, kind blue eyes, and a smile that created small crinkles at the corners of his eyes. He wore an expensive suit, but had loosened his tie and unbuttoned his collar, giving him a relaxed air that made him seem more human than the rigid businessmen she occasionally encountered at Nathan's rare social events. "Of course," Victoria heard herself say, surprised by how rusty her voice sounded. She realized she had not spoken to anyone except grocery store clerks and building security guards in nearly a week. The man sat down, maintaining a respectful distance, and pulled out his phone. Just as he did, the first fat raindrops began to fall. He laughed, a warm sound that made something flutter in Victoria's chest. "Perfect timing," he said, then extended his hand. "Owen Mitchell." Victoria hesitated for only a moment before taking his hand. Victoria Hayes. She deliberately used her maiden name, wanting this moment to exist outside the reality of her marriage. "Beautiful name," Owen said. "Are you from Chicago?" His question was casual, friendly, with no ulterior motive she could detect. Just simple human conversation, the kind Victoria had been starving for. "No," she admitted. "I moved here 6 months ago, from a little town on the coast. You would not have heard of it. Harborview." Owen's face lit up with recognition. "Harborview. I spent a summer there about 5 years ago working on a development project. Small world. Beautiful place. Do you miss it?" The simple question, asked with genuine interest, nearly broke Victoria's careful composure. "Every single day," she said quietly, her voice catching slightly. Owen's expression shifted to concern. He did not push with more questions, did not pry into her obvious sadness. Instead, he said gently, "The rain is getting worse. There is a coffee shop just across the street. Would you like to get out of the weather?" My treat. Victoria knew she should say no. She was a married woman, even if that marriage was nothing but a legal document in separate bedrooms. She should thank him politely, go home to her empty penthouse, and continue the isolated existence she had been living for 6 months. But the thought of returning to that cold, silent space made her chest tighten with dread. And this stranger, Owen Mitchell, was offering something she desperately needed. Just a conversation. Just human connection. Just the simple experience of someone seeing her and caring enough to ask if she was okay. "Coffee sounds wonderful," Victoria said. They hurried across the street together, laughing as the rain soaked through their clothes. The coffee shop was crowded and warm, filled with the rich smell of roasted beans and the comfortable murmur of conversation. They found a small table in the corner, and as Victoria wrapped her cold hands around a steaming mug of coffee, she felt something inside her begin to thaw after months of frozen isolation. Owen was easy to talk to in a way that surprised her. He asked about Harborview, about her life before Chicago, about her dreams and interests. He listened when she spoke, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to talk. Victoria found herself sharing things she had not spoken about in months. Her love of painting, which she had abandoned after moving to the city, her childhood dream of opening a small art gallery, her favorite memories of walking on the beach at sunset with her parents. She was careful not to mention Nathan, referring only vaguely to family circumstances that had brought her to Chicago. Owen seemed to sense there were things she was not saying and respected her privacy. Not pushing for details she was not ready to share. "What about you?" Victoria asked as they ordered second cups of coffee. "What brings you to Chicago?" "I run a small property development company," Owen said. "We focus on sustainable housing and community spaces. Nothing as flashy as the big players, but it is work I believe in. I would rather build something that improves people's lives than just chase the biggest profit margins." His passion was evident in the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his projects. He showed her pictures on his phone of a community center his company had recently completed, designed to serve a neighborhood that had been neglected for decades. He spoke about architecture as art, about creating spaces that brought people together rather than isolating them. It was so different from the cold, impressive towers Nathan built. Structures that inspired awe but not warmth. The weeks following that rainy afternoon in the park transformed Victoria's existence in ways she had not imagined possible. Owen became the lifeline she had not known she needed, a reminder that human connection could still exist in her isolated world. They met for coffee every few days, their conversations flowing easily, from art to philosophy to childhood memories. Owen never pressed for more than friendship, seeming to understand instinctively that Victoria needed someone who simply saw her as a person, not as an obligation or an acquisition. Their friendship remained innocent, but it filled the empty spaces in Victoria's life with light. Owen made her laugh with stories about disastrous construction mishaps and his attempts to learn Italian cooking from YouTube videos. He listened with genuine interest when she talked about the paintings she had stopped creating, encouraging her to pick up her brushes again. He remembered small details from their conversations, asking about books she had mentioned wanting to read, or how her mother's health was improving. These tiny acts of attention meant everything to someone who had spent months feeling invisible. Victoria began painting again, setting up an easel in the corner of her bedroom where morning light streamed through the windows. She painted the ocean from memory, trying to capture the exact shade of blue from Harborview sunsets. She painted the Chicago skyline as seen from her penthouse windows, but added warmth to the cold steel structures, imagining what the city might look like if it were softer, kinder, more welcoming. Owen was the first person she showed her work to, and his enthusiastic response made her feel like an artist again. Instead of just a decorative wife, Nathan remained as distant as ever, a ghost who haunted the penthouse but never truly inhabited it. If he noticed any change in Victoria, any new lightness in her step or spark in her eyes, he gave no indication. Their interactions remained brief and formal. "Good morning. The weather looks nice today. I will be working late. Do not wait up." Victoria stopped trying to engage him in real conversation, stopped hoping he might notice her new paintings or ask about her day. She had Owen's friendship now, and while it was not the marriage she had once dreamed of, it was enough to make her life bearable. Then one evening in late November, Owen called with an invitation that would shatter the careful distance Victoria had maintained between her two worlds. "There is a charity gala this Friday," he said, his voice warm through the phone. "It benefits arts education in underserved schools. Given your love of painting, I thought you might enjoy it. Would you consider coming as my guest?" Victoria's immediate instinct was to refuse. Attending a high society event with Owen felt dangerous, like publicly acknowledging their friendship in a way that might complicate everything. But before she could voice her hesitation, Owen continued. I know these events can be awkward, but this cause really matters to me. Having you there would make the whole evening more enjoyable. Just as friends, of course. No pressure, the sincerity in his voice, combined with the thought of another Friday night alone in the penthouse, made Victoria's decision for her. I would love to come, she said, surprised by how much she meant it, after hanging up. Victoria sat with the weight of what she had agreed to. She should tell Nathan. Even in their hollow marriage, even with his complete indifference to her existence, she knew it was the right thing to do. That evening, when she heard him come home earlier than usual, she gathered her courage and knocked on his study door. Enter. Nathan's voice was clipped. Distracted by whatever occupied his attention, Victoria stepped into the room, a space she rarely entered. Nathan sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, surrounded by multiple computer monitors displaying charts and documents she did not understand. He did not look up when she came in, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Even exhausted from a long day, with his tie loosened and his dark hair slightly disheveled, he was devastatingly handsome. It made everything worse somehow, that he could look like that and still have no interest in her whatsoever. I wanted to let you know. I will be attending a charity gala on Friday evening, Victoria said, keeping her voice steady and professional. It benefits arts education. Owen Mitchell invited me. The typing stopped. Nathan's hands froze over the keyboard and his gray eyes lifted to her face for the first time in weeks. They were sharp, assessing, revealing nothing of his thoughts, but suddenly intensely focused on her in a way they had not been since their wedding day. Owen Mitchell, he repeated, his tone carefully neutral. The developer who focuses on community housing, yes, Victoria confirmed, lifting her chin slightly. He is a friend. We met in the park several weeks ago. He has been kind to me. Something flickered in Nathan's eyes. There and gone so quickly, Victoria might have imagined it. A shadow of something that could have been surprise, or displeasure, or perhaps nothing at all. You do not need my permission to attend social events, he said finally, his voice flat. You are free to accept whatever invitations you wish. The dismissal was clear, exactly what Victoria had expected, but somehow still painful. I just thought you should know, she said quietly. She turned to leave, needing to escape before the familiar ache of rejection could show on her face. But Nathan's voice stopped her at the door. Victoria, she looked back, foolish hope fluttering in her chest, despite knowing better. We're something appropriate, Nathan said, his eyes already returning to his computer screens. You represent my name when you appear in public. Appearance matters. The hope died as quickly as it had sparked to life, of course. His only concern was reputation, optics, making sure his acquisition looked suitable when displayed in public. Of course, Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper, and left before he could see the tears threatening to fall. Friday arrived with Victoria feeling a complicated mixture of defiance and nervous excitement. If Nathan only cared about appearances, she would give him exactly that. She spent the afternoon at an exclusive salon, letting the stylists work their magic on her hair and makeup. Then she slipped into the gown she had purchased specifically for this evening, a dress that had cost more than seemed reasonable, but made her feel beautiful for the first time in months. The gown was midnight blue silk that seemed to shimmer when she moved, bringing out the blue in her hazel eyes. It hugged her curves elegantly before flowing into a graceful skirt, with a neckline that was sophisticated rather than provocative, but showed enough to remind the world she was a woman, not just a name in society columns. Her dark blonde hair was swept into a sophisticated updo with a few soft curls framing her face. She wore the diamond earrings Nathan had given her as a wedding gift, the only jewelry from him she had ever worn. When Victoria looked at herself in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked confident, radiant, alive in a way she had not felt since leaving Harborview. For tonight, she would not be the invisible wife or the lonely woman in the gilded cage. For tonight, she would simply be Victoria, attending an event with someone who genuinely wanted her company. Owen's reaction when she met him in the building lobby confirmed her transformation. His eyes widened with genuine admiration, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Victoria, you look absolutely stunning. Thank you," she said, warmth spreading through her chest at the sincere compliment. "You look rather wonderful yourself." Owen did look impressive in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. But what struck Victoria most was the warmth in his eyes. The way he looked at her like she mattered, like her presence genuinely made him happy. It was such a stark contrast to Nathan's cold indifference that it made her chest ache with both gratitude and sadness for what her marriage lacked. The gala was held at one of Chicago's most prestigious hotels, a historic building with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and elegant architecture that took Victoria's breath away. Owen guided her through the entrance with a gentle hand on her back, introducing her to colleagues and friends as they moved through the crowd. Everyone was kind and welcoming, treating her like a person rather than an accessory, asking about her interests and actually listening to her answers. The evening was magical in a way Victoria had not experienced since her wedding. She and Owen talked with artists and educators passionate about bringing art programs to children who otherwise would never have access to them. They bid on silent auction items, laughing at some of the more extravagant offerings. They danced when the orchestra began playing, Owen's hand warm and steady on her waist, his movements comfortable and easy. Victoria was laughing at something Owen had said, feeling lighter and happier than she had in months when she felt it. That prickling sensation of being watched, the sudden awareness of a presence that changed the entire atmosphere around her. She turned her head and froze. Nathan stood near the entrance to the ballroom, and he was staring directly at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was not alone. A beautiful woman in a red dress stood beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm, but Nathan was not looking at his companion. He was looking at Victoria with an expression she had never seen on his face before. His jaw was tight, his gray eyes storm-dark, and focused entirely on her with something that looked almost like anger. Or perhaps something more complicated that she could not quite name. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Victoria felt the connection like a physical shock. For 6 months, Nathan had barely looked at her, had treated her like she was invisible, or at best, mildly inconvenient. Now he was staring at her like she was the only person in the room, and the intensity of his gaze made her heart race in a way that felt dangerous. Owen noticed her distraction and followed her gaze. His expression shifted to understanding and something else. Concern, perhaps, or resignation. "That is Nathan Grayson," he said quietly. "Your husband?" It was not a question, Owen knew. Had probably known from the beginning, Victoria realized with a mixture of embarrassment and relief. "You knew who I was?" she said softly, still not breaking eye contact with Nathan across the room. "I figured it out after our second coffee," Owen admitted. "You mentioned your married name once, without thinking, and I put the pieces together. I did not say anything because I could see how unhappy you were, and I thought maybe you needed a friend more than you needed someone reminding you of your situation." Victoria finally tore her gaze away from Nathan to look at Owen. "I am sorry I did not tell you." Directly, Owen shook his head gently. "You do not owe me explanations, Victoria. Your marriage is your business. I just hope I have not made things more difficult for you." Before Victoria could respond, she felt another presence approaching. She turned to find Nathan standing directly behind her, his companion nowhere in sight. Up close, his expression was even more intense, his gray eyes moving between Victoria and Owen with something that looked dangerously close to possessiveness. "Victoria," Nathan said, his voice low and controlled, but with an edge she had never heard before. "I did not know you would be here tonight. It was a lie." She had told him exactly where she would be, but Victoria did not call him on it. "Owen invited me," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Nathan, this is Owen Mitchell. Owen, my husband Nathan Grayson." The two men shook hands, and Victoria could feel the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. "We have met," Nathan said, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face, "at various industry events. I was not aware you had become friends with my wife." "Victoria has been kind enough to humor my company," Owen said smoothly, his voice polite but firm. "She mentioned she was new to Chicago and did not know many people yet. I have enjoyed getting to know her. She is remarkable." The compliment hung in the air between them. Nathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Victoria saw his hands clench briefly at his sides before he forced them to relax. "Is that so?" he said, and something in his tone made Victoria's skin prickle with awareness. The orchestra began playing a new song, a slow waltz that filled the ballroom with romantic melody. Nathan turned his full attention to Victoria, extending his hand with a gesture that was both invitation and command. "Dance with me," he said. It was not a question. Victoria stared at Nathan's extended hand as though it were something foreign and inexplicable. In 6 months of marriage, he had never touched her beyond that single handshake on their wedding day. He had never asked her to dance, never invited her anywhere, never shown the slightest interest in her company. Now he stood before her with his hand outstretched and an expression on his face that was almost desperate beneath its controlled surface. Demanding something he had no right to ask for, she should refuse. Every reasonable part of her brain screamed that she should politely decline. Continue her evening with Owen, and let Nathan return to whatever companion he had arrived with. But there was something in his eyes that stopped her refusal before it could form. Something raw and unguarded that she had never seen in him before. A crack in the ice that had always surrounded him completely, of course. Victoria heard herself say, placing her hand in his. Nathan's fingers closed around hers, and she felt the shock of contact travel up her arm. His hand was warm and strong, and he held hers like something precious he was afraid might break or disappear. He led her onto the dance floor without a word, and when he placed his other hand on her waist, Victoria felt the heat of his palm through the thin silk of her gown. They began to move together, and Victoria was surprised by how naturally Nathan led, how easily her body followed his movements. For someone who seemed so uncomfortable with human connection, he danced with practiced grace and confidence. They moved in silence for several moments, a tension between them thick enough to feel physical. "You look beautiful tonight," Nathan said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. His gray eyes were fixed on her face with that same unsettling intensity, as though he were seeing her for the first time. "Thank you," Victoria replied carefully, unsure how to navigate this sudden attention from a man who had spent 6 months ignoring her existence. "You told me to wear something appropriate." Something flickered across Nathan's face, an emotion too quick to catch, but that looked almost like regret or shame. "I did not mean it that way," he said quietly. "I just meant that you should look your best. You always do, but tonight you are radiant." The compliment, so unexpected and seemingly sincere, made Victoria's chest tighten with conflicting emotions. "Where is your date?" she asked, needing to remind both of them that he had arrived with someone else, that he had no right to suddenly act possessive when he had shown nothing but indifference for months. "She is a business associate," Nathan said dismissively. "Her company is investing in one of my developments. She asked to attend tonight, and I agreed because it was convenient." His hand tightened slightly on Victoria's waist. "She is no one important, and what am I?" Victoria asked, surprising herself with her boldness. The words escaped before she could stop them, months of hurt and loneliness giving her courage she did not normally possess. "Am I someone important, Nathan? Because for 6 months, you have treated me like no one at all." Nathan's steps faltered almost imperceptibly before he recovered. His jaw clenched, and Victoria saw something like pain flash across his features. "You are my wife," he said, as though that explained everything. "In name only," Victoria countered, her voice soft but steady. "We are strangers who happen to share the same address. You made that very clear from the beginning. So forgive me if I am confused about why you suddenly care who I spend time with, or what I wear, or whether I am at this event." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as though looking for something he had lost and desperately wanted to find again. "You are right," he said finally. "I have been distant. I have neglected you. I thought that was what you would prefer. What would make this arrangement easier for both of us?" "Easier?" Victoria repeated, feeling anger rise in her chest for the first time since their wedding. "You thought it would be easier for me to live in complete isolation? To be married to someone who treats me like I do not exist? I gave up everything for you, Nathan. My home, my family, my entire life. And you could not even be bothered to have a single real conversation with me in 6 months. The music swelled around them. Other couples moving gracefully across the floor, completely unaware of the storm happening between Nathan and Victoria. Nathan's grip on her hand and waist tightened, not painfully, but firmly, as though he were afraid she might pull away and disappear into the crowd. "I know," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion she had never heard from him. "I know I have failed you. I know I have been cold and absent and everything a husband should not be. But seeing you tonight with him, seeing you smile and laugh and look happy in a way I have never made you look, it made me realize what I have been throwing away." Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes but refused to let them fall. "You have no right," she whispered. "You cannot ignore me for months and then suddenly decide you want my attention just because someone else is giving it to me. That is not how this works, Nathan." "I know," he said again, and this time his voice was almost pleading. "I know I have no right, but I am asking anyway. I am asking you to give me a chance to be the husband I should have been from the beginning. To show you that I can be more than the cold, distant man you have been living with." The song was ending, the final notes of the waltz fading into silence. Other couples were separating, moving off the dance floor, but Nathan made no move to release Victoria. He stood holding her, his gray eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "Why now?" Victoria asked, needing to understand. "Why does it matter now when it did not matter for 6 months?" Nathan's expression shifted, becoming more vulnerable than Victoria had ever seen it. "Because I have been lying to myself," he said quietly. "I told myself this was just a business arrangement, that keeping my distance was the professional thing to do. I told myself you were better off without my attention, that you did not want a real marriage any more than I did. But tonight, seeing you with Owen Mitchell, watching you be happy with someone else, I realized something I have been too stubborn and too scared to admit." "What?" Victoria whispered, her heart pounding so hard she was certain Nathan could feel it. "That I want you to look at me the way you look at him," Nathan said, and his voice was raw with honesty. "I want to be the one who makes you smile and laugh. I want to know what makes you happy and what your dreams are, and what you think about when you stand at those windows every night." "I have been a coward, Victoria. I have been hiding behind work and distance because the alternative terrified me, but I cannot hide anymore. Not when I might lose you to someone who has the courage. I have been lacking." Victoria felt something crack open inside her chest. Some locked door she had sealed shut after months of rejection and loneliness. Part of her wanted to believe Nathan's words, to trust that this sudden change was real and lasting. But another part of her, the part that had survived 6 months of isolation, remained cautious and protective. "I do not know if I can trust this," she admitted honestly. "I do not know if this is real or if you will wake up tomorrow and go back to being the distant stranger I have been living with. I have spent 6 months trying to reach you, Nathan. I tried so hard at the beginning to make you see me, to make this marriage into something real, and you rejected every attempt. You cannot blame me for being afraid to try again." Nathan's hands released hers, but only so he could cup her face gently between his palms. The gesture was so tender, so unexpected, that Victoria's breath caught in her throat. "I am not asking you to trust me immediately," he said, his thumbs brushing softly against her cheekbones. "I am asking you to give me the opportunity to earn that trust. Let me show you that I can change. Let me prove that I can be the partner you deserve." Before Victoria could respond, Owen appeared beside them, his expression concerned and protective. "Victoria, are you all right?" he asked gently, his eyes moving between her and Nathan with careful assessment. The spell broke. Nathan's hands dropped from Victoria's face, and his expression shuddered slightly, returning to something closer to the controlled mask he usually wore. But Victoria could still see the emotion beneath the surface. The desperation and hope and fear all tangled together. "I am fine," Victoria said, stepping back slightly to create space between herself and Nathan. "Owen, thank you for a wonderful evening. I think I should go home now. I can drive you," Owen offered immediately. But Victoria shook her head. "Nathan can take me," she said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. "We need to talk." Owen hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Call me if you need anything," he said, directing the words at Victoria, but looking at Nathan with a meaningful intensity. "Any time, for any reason." "I will," Victoria promised, squeezing Owen's hand briefly in gratitude. "Thank you for everything." The drive back to the penthouse was silent and charged with tension. Nathan drove his own car, a sleek black vehicle that suited him perfectly, his hands gripping the steering wheel with controlled precision. Victoria sat in the passenger seat, watching the city lights blur past her window, trying to organize the chaos of emotions swirling through her. When they arrived at the building and took the private elevator up to the penthouse, Victoria felt her heart racing with nervousness and anticipation. The elevator doors opened directly into their apartment, and suddenly they were alone together in a way they had never truly been before. No distractions, no excuses to walk away, just the two of them, and 6 months of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Nathan loosened his tie and ran a hand through his dark hair, suddenly looking less like the controlled businessman and more like a man struggling with emotions he did not know how to process. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked, his voice uncertain in a way Victoria had never heard. "No," Victoria said, removing her coat and hanging it carefully. "I want you to talk to me, Nathan." "Really talk to me? Tell me why you have been so cold, so distant. Tell me what changed tonight. I need to understand." Nathan poured himself a glass of whiskey with hands that were not quite steady, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows where Victoria had stood so many lonely evenings. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with more emotion than Victoria had heard from him in all their months together. "My parents had a terrible marriage," began staring out at the city lights. "They married young for all the wrong reasons, and they spent 30 years making each other miserable. My father was cold and controlling, obsessed with building his business empire. My mother was lonely and bitter, trapped in a life she had not chosen. They stayed together because divorce would have been bad for the company image, but they hated each other. The house I grew up in was beautiful and expensive and completely devoid of love or warmth." Victoria moved closer, not touching him, but near enough to see his reflection in the window glass. She could see the pain on his face, old wounds that had never properly healed. "I watched them destroy each other slowly over decades," Nathan continued. "I watched my mother become a shell of a person, all her dreams and hopes crushed under the weight of a loveless marriage. And I promised myself I would never do that to anyone. I would never trap someone in a relationship they did not want, never let myself become the cold, distant man my father was." "But that is exactly what you did," Victoria said softly, without accusation, just stating the truth they both knew. Nathan turned to face her, and his eyes were filled with self-recrimination and regret. "I know," he said. "When I proposed this arrangement to save your father's business, I told myself it was different. I told myself you were entering into it willingly, with full knowledge of what it would be. A marriage in name only, nothing more. I thought if I kept my distance, if I did not allow myself to get close to you, it would be better for both of us. You could live your life, I could live mine. And neither of us would end up like my parents." Victoria felt understanding begin to dawn, painful but necessary. "You were trying to protect me," she said. "By pushing me away, you thought you were saving me from becoming your mother." Nathan nodded, his expression raw and vulnerable. "But I did not account for one thing," he said quietly. "I did not account for the fact that I would want more, that I would find myself thinking about you constantly, wondering what you were doing, whether you were happy, what you were thinking about. I would come home late at night and walk past your door and have to force myself not to knock, not to ask if I could just sit and talk with you." Victoria felt her heart clench at the admission. "Then why did you not?" she asked. "Why did you let me believe you did not care at all?" "Because I was terrified," Nathan admitted, and the confession seemed to cost him something. "I was terrified that if I let myself get close to you, I would become my father, cold and controlling and ultimately destructive. I was terrified that you would come to hate me the way my mother hated him. So I stayed away, thinking distance was kindness. But tonight, seeing you with Owen Mitchell, watching you be happy with someone who was willing to give you what I was too scared to offer, I realized something." "What?" Victoria whispered. "That I was already becoming my father," Nathan said, his voice breaking slightly. not by getting too close, but by shutting you out. By being cold and distant and making you feel invisible. I was doing exactly what I had promised myself I would never do, and I was too blind to see it until I watched another man appreciate what I had been taking for granted. Nathan closed the distance between them, stopping just inches from Victoria. His hands moved as though he wanted to touch her, then dropped back to his sides, as if he were afraid he had lost the right. "I cannot promise I will be perfect," he said quietly. "I cannot promise I will not make mistakes, or that I will always know the right thing to say or do. But I can promise that I will try. I will try to be the husband you deserve, the partner who sees you and values you and makes you feel appreciated every single day. If you will give me that chance." Victoria looked up at him, searching his face for any sign that this was temporary, that he would wake up tomorrow and return to being the distant stranger. But all she saw was sincerity and hope and fear that mirrored her own. She thought about the 6 months of loneliness, the pain of being invisible to the man she had married. But she also thought about the vulnerability he was showing now, the courage it took to admit his fears and his failures. "I am not asking for perfection," Victoria said finally. "I am asking for effort, for presence, for the chance to actually know the man I married instead of living with a ghost. Can you give me that?" Nathan's hands finally rose to cup her face again, gentle and reverent. "Yes," he breathed. "I can give you that. I want to give you that. I want to give you everything I should have been giving you from the beginning. Then we start over," Victoria said, her voice firm despite the tears now sliding down her cheeks. "Not as strangers forced into an arrangement, but as two people choosing to build something real. Together." "Together," Nathan agreed. And then he did something he had never done before. He leaned down and kissed her, soft and tentative and filled with promise. The kiss was gentle at first, almost questioning, as though Nathan were afraid Victoria might pull away. But when she leaned into him instead, and her hands came up to rest against his chest and she kissed him back with 6 months of pent-up longing, something shifted. The kiss deepened, became more certain, more real. Nathan's arms came around her, pulling her close against him, and Victoria felt the warmth of human connection she had been starving for. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the day I first saw you," he admitted quietly. "You were standing in your father's office wearing a blue dress and looking terrified but brave. And I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. I told myself it did not matter, that this was business. But I have been lying to myself for 6 months." Victoria laughed softly, the sound watery with tears, but genuine. "I have wanted you to see me for 6 months," she said. "To really see me, not just as an obligation or a transaction, but as a person. As your wife?" "I see you now," Nathan promised, brushing away her tears with gentle thumbs. "And I will not stop seeing you. Not ever again." They stood together in the middle of the penthouse that had felt like a prison for so long, holding each other as the city lights twinkled beyond the windows. Victoria knew this was just the beginning, that they had a long road ahead to build trust and understanding and genuine love. But for the first time since her wedding day, she felt hope. Real, solid hope that her marriage might become something true and lasting. Nathan took her hand and led her to the couch. Pulling her down to sit beside him, he kept her hand in his, as though afraid that letting go might break the fragile connection they had just formed. "Tell me about Vermont," he said. "Tell me about growing up in Harborview. Tell me everything I should have asked you months ago," so Victoria did. She told him about her childhood home near the harbor, about learning to paint while sitting on the beach, about her grandmother's stories and her father's terrible singing and her mother's gentle strength. Nathan listened intently, asking questions, laughing at the right moments, his thumb tracing absent patterns on the back of her hand. And slowly, carefully, they began building the foundation of something neither of them had expected to find. Not just a marriage of convenience, but a partnership built on honesty and effort, and the courage to be vulnerable with each other. As dawn began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Victoria and Nathan were still talking, still learning about each other. still discovering that the ice between them had never been permanent. It had just been waiting for someone to be brave enough to start melting it away. And now, finally, they both were. The end.